We're going to spend just a little bit of time today talking about money. It's always on everybody's mind, especially when allocations come out. Many of you want to know why my allocation is the way that it is. And oftentimes we get asked, can you just send me the formula so I can figure it out on my own? And the answer to that is no. It's not a secret formula by any stretch, but the part that goes into the formula that Sheree is really going to talk about is that each one of your districts plays a part in that. And so when one district's poverty count goes up and their population goes up and another district's population goes down, all of those are different pieces that fit together that puzzle to determine what your allocation is. Because a lot of times you'll look and say, we didn't change in population and our poverty level stayed the same. Why did our allocation go down so much more? I have to explain this to my board, to my superintendent. I need answers. And so that's when you're going to call Sheree. Most of this presentation is Sheree, and she's going to talk about all of that for you. And so some of you have been with me before. Okay. All right. So some of you have been with me before, and I've talked about some of these slides. We're looking back at 25 funds and 24 funds. And Jennifer has talked to some of you already that with those allocations for 25 and 24, there was a revision to FY25. And there was also a revision with 24 for Title 1C, Title 2, Title 3, Title 4, Part B, all in September. Thank you. So one of the things like I kind of alluded to earlier, you want to know how the allocations are determined. And is there just a simple mathematical equation of just poverty and enrollment? Both of those are factors in it, but it's not all to it. Like I said, each one of your districts affects another district. Okay, so District A may have had a similar demographic to yours. Why does their allocation look different? Because you may both have 1,000 students, but one of you has a poverty rate of 85% for your district. The other district may have a poverty rate of 45%. All of those factors are part of what goes into the allocation. So you keep telling me you got it. um, so this changed just recently with getting our preliminary allocations, right? So even since we've done our slides, we now have preliminaries. And then, of course, we're looking at census data. That census data right now, the challenge period is ending on March 27th, so in just a few more days. And I want to talk about the census data for just a moment. So many of you, if you've gone to national, you may have seen this slide, and if you haven't, I want to just touch on this for a moment. Notice that South Carolina is in orange, right? There's been a change in the census data for South Carolina. We look more affluent than what we looked before, okay? What does that mean for South Carolina? Less money. Our piece of the pie was reduced for Title I by what, $3.4 million. I'm going to go ahead and set it up for you. You may see a reduction in your Title I funding. Some of the districts, it may not be the case for every district, but just for the sake of argument, plan on a reduction, okay? I have always said when I talk Title I allocations, always go from year to year thinking you're going to receive 15% less than you received in your current year. That helps you out in a couple of ways because you're planning for the worst. What's the worst possible scenario? You're planning for that. Isn't it a lot easier to talk to your principals later? They've planned on a 15% cut and they've budgeted accordingly. Then, go back to them a little later and say, guess what? April Fools, you're getting a little more. They're happier that way, right? It's hard, and we've had to do it maybe once or twice that I know of giving out allocations before and then having to come back and try to take it back from the districts. That's a hard thing to do. It's something that our agency has worked very hard not to do. There have been a couple of cases where we did receive a reduction well into the year. And what we did as the agency, we just took the loss from our state admin funds instead of coming to you and say, hey, Denise, I need $40,000 back. That's unfair for those principals and those students when you've budgeted for certain activities to happen. And some of you receive small amounts of funds in some of your schools that's a huge blow to the activities and programs in that school. So we, knock on wood, have not had to do that in recent years. And hopefully that won't come anytime soon for us. Yep. All right, so the data that we use to determine our preliminary allocation, of course, are the state per pupil expenditures that SPPE, and you call it SAPE. And then, of course, we also use the, school 23-24 and the school year 22-23 data for that to make those calculations. And that helps us to determine what the preliminaries are. And I'm going to turn it over to Sheree because you know what? She gets into the weeds every single time with these allocations. And you're normally talking to her when you're upset about your funds. But today we're not going to be upset. Sheree's just going to explain the process to you, and hopefully you'll have a better indication. Go ahead, Sheree.
Hello. For those of you who don't know, my name is Sheree Mosley. I am what I jokingly say in the office, I am your allocation expert. So usually if there is any questions about your allocations, I get many calls about I have to meet with my superintendent. I have to go to my board and explain to them why our allocation has went down. I am the person to call to give you the statistics based on why your allocation is what it is. And so for this slide, it's a data used to determine your preliminary allocations for Title I B, C, and D. What goes into that are multiple data sets. It's not just your poverty, but we're talking about your census. We're talking about state agency counts. For your Title I Part D, you're talking about children locally and delinquent in N&D institution. All of those, the consensus of all of that is what makes up, what goes into making up your Title I allocation. And so this is data used to determine preliminaries for Title II and Title IV. Most of the grants use similar information. Title I is the big bear. Title II and Title IV, they don't use as many data sets, but some of the data sets are similar. So for Title II, the information that is used for that is your state's 5 to 17 population, and of that population, those who are of poverty. For Title IV, though there's not necessarily an application for that, but your Title IV application allocation is prepared off of the previous year's Title I. And so if you had a lower Title I allocation the year before, then in most cases, your Title IV allocation for the current year will most likely be lower as well. Then you have it's going back into it with hold harmless, the way, because we talked a little bit earlier about how hold harmless works. The way that it works in most cases is, say for instance, your district has $5 million and the state overall took a decrease in that allocation. So what will happen is that the hold harmless just ensures that your district, in most cases, sometimes it try to keep you leveled at what you may have had the year before, so that you don't drop so low. And then that also plays into the school improvement portion of it as well. All right, estimating the FY25 Title I allocation, gathering the data. As you can see, one, it uses the census poverty data, which was released in January of 2026. The state submitted non-census formula. That's children living in institutions, which is your neglected and delinquent students. Those children as well, which is the 5 to 17, which are above poverty. TANF, foster care, all of those impact your Title I allocation. And so this is a chart that was shared with us at national conference last year, just to kind of give us an idea of what it means estimating the allocations, the formula counts, and how it works and how it varies from district to district. And so just if you can look, just you have your LEAs, LEA 1, 2, 3, and then you have the census poverty for those districts. Some districts have neglected, some don't have neglected, some have foster, and all of that. So again, you may, with the example that Drew used, you may have a district that have the same amount of students, and you're trying to figure out, well, why our allocation isn't the same or their allocation is higher. Where you may have neglected students where this other district may not. And it just shows the total amount of your poverty students, the census total of those students, and then it gives you a percentage of what your formula percentage is for each district. Okay, and so this is a part of the allocation that is determined at the U.S. Department of Education. For Title I allocations, it is broken up into 4 pots, which is your basic, your concentration, your targeted, and your EFIG. Usually, if you are a district, you're trying to figure out why did allocations go down. When you call me, this is going to be the first place that I go, because most times this is where you're going to see your initial decrease. So this information is already predetermined before it comes to the State Department. And then you have some districts who are eligible for all 4 pots. You may have some districts who are only eligible for 3. And then you may, for whatever reason, depending on the certain data sets, you may have some districts who are only eligible for 2. And so all of that plays a major impact into whether you may see an increase or a decrease in your allocation. So step 3, eligibility for each formula. So it shows each LEA, the number of formula children that each district has, and then it shows you whether you're eligible or not. So if you go down based on the percentage, LEA number 1 has 40%, they're eligible for all 4 pots of those grants. Whereas if you go down to LEA number 5, they only have 9 formula students, which is 9% formula for each for their students, and they're not eligible for any of those pots. So again, all of this plays a part in whether you may see an increase or a decrease in your allocation. And Jennifer talked about this a little bit in her session about hold harmless. Just give you an idea of how hold harmless works, and how it also affects school improvement. And so each eligible LEA is entitled to the following percentages of its prior allocation amount, depending on what percent its number of formula children is to its total number of children between ages 5 to 17. So 90%, 95% for LEAs with a formula rate equal or greater to 30%, 90% for LEAs with formula child rate that is equal or greater to than 15%, but less than 30%. And then you have your 85% for LEAs with a formula child rate of less than 15%. And so what that means is that, like I said, with the example that I gave earlier, so you may have an increase in formula students, but say, for instance, allocations took a decrease. Hold harmless just kind of holds you there so that you don't feel such of an impact if your allocation is decreased because of your formula students. And it also explains here that if an LEA is not eligible under the basic, the targeted, the concentrated, or the EFIG, then your hold harmless won't apply. And if an LEA is not eligible to receive the concentration in the current year, but is eligible for at least once in 4 immediate prior years, the hold harmless will apply. And this right here is just a chart just to give you an idea of what that hold harmless eligibility looks like. Looking at your LEA number 1, it shows they have a 40% for formula. The hold harmless for those is holding that hold harmless at 95% for them across the board for the concentration, the EFIG, and the targeted grants. But if you go down to your LEA number 5, with their formula percentage is only 9%, it's showing that they're not eligible for any of those pots. So the hold harmless, like I said, it just tries to keep you in a place where you don't feel such an impact when there's a decrease in your allocation. All right, estimating the minimum FY27 allocations is step 5 under each formula. At this stage, state or LEA may use hold harmless estimates on the prior slides to estimate the minimum allocation for each LEA. To further refine that, it said states LEA may find it helpful to estimate the total amount of the funds each LEA contribute to the school improvement. So the way that the formula works is that if your allocation is less than what it was the year before, then your district does not contribute to the 7% school improvement. And so that's kind of how that works. But over the last several years that I've been doing the allocation, we have not been able to reserve the full 7% because our allocation has been decreasing each year. And so usually if we were to take the full, just for example, if we were to take the full 7%, school improvement right might would have been anywhere between maybe 19, maybe 20 million. But over the last several years, it's been between maybe 12. It's been about 12 million that we've been able to reserve for school improvement. All right. And so again, this is just another chart just to give you an example of what it could look like for each of the 4 pots under each formula grant, depending on whether your district qualified for all 4 pots, only 3 pots, or even just 2 pots. So if you just looking at number 1 as an example in comparison to what LEA number 5 looked like, their allocation for the basic grant is a lot more. So as you can go over to each one of the concentrated, the targeted, the EFIG, last year in comparison to the current year, FY25 LEA 1 for the basic pot was $550,000. But then if you go to the FY26 basic grant, that LEA, it dropped down to about 522. So like I said, it just depends on the eligibility status and the data sets that is at hand for your specific district. All right, and this is another part of Title I that I think some districts don't take into consideration. These are pots that are also pulled off for for Title I. And so it's not just the regular standard districts across the state. So there's an allocation that's pulled off of Title I for all of the charter districts. All of the charter districts affect the regular districts as well. I also have to pull off, there's a reservation for the neglected and delinquent. If you were just if any of you were in Lakeisha's session, she talked about that. All of that is a part of Title I. And it talks about the district for facility count, how many students are in those districts, allocation to determine the funding. Again, total formula counts are used to determine a per pupil amount for those neglected and delinquent facilities. And then we go down to our charter districts. The charter districts, we don't collect student count data from them until until final. Preliminary data is information that is used from the previous year's final allocation. And we usually collect that data from the charter districts at their 135th day.
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Did I hear you say that you don't consider the charter district full until the final? So when we receive our preliminary, the charter districts haven't been factored into that number yet?
They are factored into that number, but I don't collect the new student count data for them until the final.
But that could be one of the variables.
That is another variable. So yeah, so if you have a charter, so if say for instance you may have a district that lose 200 students from a traditional district and they go over to the charter, and so that's going to affect your allocation. That may affect the traditional district's allocation to go down, where you may look at the allocation if you've seen that charter school district allocation have went up by nearly $1 million, and you're like, well, how did that happen? And that's one of the reasons how that could happen. You're welcome. All right, and just to talk a little about state set-asides. So for your Title I, your Title II, and your Title IV, there's a 1% state allocation that is set aside for the administration portions of the grant. One thing I can tell you is that the majority of the allocation, we do try to push it out to the districts. I talked briefly about the school improvement. It is a 7% cap, but over the last several years, we have not been able to reserve that full 7% because our allocations have been decreasing over the years. And then for Title II, there's two pots of funding, leader preparation and other activities that's capped at 2%. And then you have your Title V admin that is capped at 3%.
Go back to that slide, Sheree, for a moment. So I do want to say one thing that we haven't taken out of your funding for Title I has been the additional 3% direct student services. That's an allocation. We've done that one time, and that set aside, if we pull that 3%, of course, you know that affects your bottom line with your district allocation. We would redistribute those funds, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your district would have still received the same amount that we pulled from you for the direct student services. Direct student services allocations have the same functions in many cases that you could have already worked in your Title I plans, but they're restricted to just really looking at things closer like tutoring services and the like. So we have always said, let's not reserve that 3%, give you your full Title I funding to do what it is that you feel would be more beneficial for your groups of children. Luckily, and that was one of the things our state superintendent was really interested in, because how many of you seen all the different guidance summaries that have come from the Department of Ed. Nothing new, but it's, hey, did you know that you could do this? And we have had many state superintendents that are looking at that 3% 3% set aside to say, hey, why don't we pull that 3% and we can do wonderful things at the state? We have said, no, we don't want that. We've tried that once before. It was not as popular as you think. And you cannot use those funds at the state level. They must be pushed back out to districts. This year, I will say that our state superintendent has agreed that we do not need to pull that extra 3%. And aren't we lucky that we didn't? Because we've also had that reduction. So that if we took that 3% as well as the reduction that we had, all of you, I could look in your face and say, you're definitely getting a cut. So luckily that didn't happen for us this go round. And I will continue to say we don't want it unless you all convince me otherwise that you really want it. Now, if you want it, I will fight for it for you. But I'm thinking right now, all of you want those funds to come back to your district. As many dollars as you can have in your district, you want access to them in the ways that you determine were important for your district. So if you hear rumblings from superintendents because they've heard that there's a 3% set aside that's going to give them more money, because that's kind of how it's pushed out to them to think that they're getting more money, you must also explain to them it's not more money, it's just repurposing the money that should have come to you anyway. So if we took $100,000 from you, from your Title I allocation to push into that 3%, your district may only be receiving $20,000. That's not a good trade-off, really. So make sure that you explain that to your superintendent. Sometimes they'll come back from a superintendent's roundtable or a different conference and they hear it. Make sure that they understand what happens with that 3%. And I think we talk really, really fast.
Yeah, that was
Really
it.
fast. I'm so sorry about that. However, if you have questions, we'll entertain your questions. We certainly don't want to keep you out of the opportunity to ask questions. But if you want to go home and try to decompress from all that you learned over these 2 days, we don't fault you for that either. But we do thank you for coming and joining us today. Yes, thank you. Just one question, and maybe there is an answer to it. So we know there's a possibility we will see decrease. We also know there's possibility out of our control. We don't know when we might get gains, so we don't know exactly when funding would be released. And this year, they were so very slow coming out. Yeah. Our hope is that, and we keep stressing to each step in the process that we have to speak to on our side of rushing those GANs out. But part of the issue was getting the GANs. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I know, we understand, I think most of us, that you can't hand us something we don't have. Right. I'm not so worried about y'all taking care of us because you've always taken care of us the best you could. I'm more worried about the fact we're not really sure what agency is going to give you your GAN and the timing of it, therefore you can't give us ours. Do you have any suggestions? It's going to be an odd year, and the reason I'm asking is, at least in Berkeley's situation, we're also seeing local funding decrease. And so there's a whole bunch of people besides me really worried about money this year, and the school board that's really worried about money. And I don't know that they're also going to understand the fact that we also, on our side of the fence, have some things we can't control either. Do you have Um, this suggestion that I have is to be very cautious of new initiatives that you're trying to roll out. I think we'll be fine for things like salaries and some of the norms, but if there is a big initiative, a new initiative, I don't know whether I would be so anxious to roll that out just yet